The ground beneath the tallest building on Earth is moving. Not in some poetic, metaphorical way. Not buried in a footnote that nobody reads. Actually moving. Measurable. Documented. And some of the most important engineering concerns surrounding that movement receive far less public attention than the construction announcements that built the city's reputation. Welcome to Strategic Dynamics Edge. This channel exists for people who want real analysis, not the version that gets packaged into a press release. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell, because what we cover here is the kind of content that rarely surfaces on its own, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Now let us get into it. Dubai built itself on an argument. The argument was this: nature is not a partner. Nature is an obstacle. And if you have enough money, enough concrete, enough ambition, you can simply engineer around it. The desert was not a limitation. It was a blank page. The sea was not a boundary. It was a construction site. The heat, the salt, the unstable ground, all of it was just a backdrop for something that had never been done before. And for decades, the photographs, the satellite images, the record-breaking headlines, all of them seemed to say that the argument was correct. But arguments made against nature have a shelf life. And what available monitoring data suggests is happening beneath Dubai right now is that shelf life being tested in real time. Before anything else, let us give credit where it is due. The Burj Khalifa is a genuine engineering achievement. The tower sits on 192 reinforced concrete piles, each one drilled 50 meters into the ground. Those piles carry roughly 500,000 tons of building weight and distribute it across a massive concrete raft at the base. The engineers who designed it knew the ground was difficult. The top layer of soil across much of Dubai is called sabkha. It is a salt-saturated sediment that swells when moisture enters it and shrinks when it dries. It is one of the least hospitable materials to build anything heavy on. The engineers knew this, so they went deep. They pushed past the sabkha, past the unstable upper layers, down into more solid rock below. They modeled the soil, they tested it, and they built a foundation designed to handle everything they could project in 2004 when construction began. The challenge is what they could not fully project in 2004, because what surrounds that tower today is nothing like what existed when the plans were drawn. A quick note before we continue. Everything discussed in this video draws from publicly available engineering research, satellite-based monitoring studies, infrastructure analysis, and reported accounts. This is not financial advice, not legal advice, and not a prediction of structural failure. The Burj Khalifa is not about to collapse. This is analytical storytelling, intended to help you understand patterns and pressures that rarely receive straightforward coverage. With that said, let us keep going. The phenomenon at the center of this story is called subsidence. That is the technical term for when ground sinks over time. It happens in cities around the world. Jakarta has sunk by 4 meters in some areas. Mexico City loses roughly 20 centimeters every year in its worst zones because it was built on a drained lakebed. Venice is perhaps the most famous example. Subsidence is not rare. What makes Dubai's situation worth examining closely is not that it is happening. It is the combination of pressures that are causing it simultaneously, right underneath one of the densest concentrations of super tall buildings in the region. The first pressure is groundwater depletion. Dubai relies heavily on desalinated seawater for drinking, but according to available regional hydrology research, irrigation for the city's parks, golf courses, and highway landscaping draws significantly from underground aquifers. Those aquifers are being drawn down faster than any natural recharge cycle can replace. When aquifer levels drop, the soil above loses internal support. It compacts. The surface descends. Monitoring data cited in publicly available infrastructure studies indicates differential settlement of between 8 and 22 millimeters across the downtown Dubai district over a recent 5-year period. That sounds small, but in a foundation system engineered to millimeter-level tolerances, unexpected movement at that scale matters. The second pressure is heat. Dubai's surface temperature reaches 53 degrees Celsius in July. The Burj Khalifa's steel and concrete expand and contract with every thermal cycle, and the engineers accounted for that by building expansion joints into the structure at precise intervals. What was harder to fully model was the long-term effect of extreme heat on the sabkha layer itself. Some geotechnical researchers have suggested that the urban heat island effect created by Dubai's density of glass and asphalt has altered soil behavior at depth in ways that original models did not anticipate. Not catastrophically, but differently enough to be worth monitoring closely over time. The third pressure is accumulated weight. In 2004, downtown Dubai was a construction drawing. By the mid-2020s, it had become one of the densest clusters of super tall buildings outside of Manhattan and Hong Kong. That accumulated mass of towers, roads, hotels, and infrastructure was placed on the ground in the sequence that developers could finance, not necessarily in the sequence a geotechnical engineer would recommend. In most large-scale urban development on uncertain soil, Engineers preload the ground first, compressing it intentionally so settling happens in a controlled way before anything critical is built on top. The pace of Dubai's development did not always allow for that process. Now here is where this stops being a story about one building and starts being a story about a system. The Dubai Fountain Lake, the massive artificial pool at the base of the Burj Khalifa, holds nearly 10 million liters of water and hosts the most watched light and water show on the planet. Available public tender documents from Dubai's Municipal Engineering Department show that remediation work was carried out on a section of the lake perimeter in 2022, described as addressing water infiltration through the basin structure. That is a factual statement from a public document. Water moving beneath a structure sitting on salt-reactive soil, adjacent to a foundation system dealing with documented settlement, is something engineers take seriously. And then there is the Palm Jumeirah, the artificial island reclaimed from the Gulf using sand dredged from the seabed, shaped by GPS-guided dredging equipment, and declared complete between 2001 and 2006. Engineering guidance for reclaimed land generally recommends allowing several years of consolidation before heavy construction begins, so the sediment can settle under its own weight. The Atlantis Hotel opened on the Palm in November 2008, approximately 2 years after reclamation was declared complete. Satellite monitoring data now indicates the outer ring road of the Palm is settling at rates of 4 to 12 millimeters per year depending on the section measured, and the central trunk has shown asymmetric settlement patterns. Some researchers who study reclaimed land suggest these patterns are consistent with sediment that did not have sufficient consolidation time before construction loads were applied. One engineer who reportedly worked on projects in the Business Bay district gave an account, published in an Iranian engineering journal, describing what he called a culture of scheduled optimism in construction management, where monitoring results outside expected tolerances are sometimes addressed by adjusting the tolerance framework rather than pausing for deeper investigation. That account has not been independently verified, and it represents one perspective from one source, but it raises a question worth asking about any major construction environment operating under significant financial pressure. How does a system respond when the data does not match the plan? That question connects directly to the economic dimension of this story. Between 2022 and 2024, Dubai's off-plan real estate market absorbed an estimated $82 billion in sales, according to regional market reports. A large portion of those buyers were international investors purchasing properties they had never visited. Some analysts argue that when buyers are acquiring assets primarily based on brand and narrative rather than direct inspection, the information gap between what is publicly promoted and what engineering monitoring records show becomes a meaningful factor in assessing long-term risk. That is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how large-scale real estate markets operate, when growth is the primary story being told. Dubai's total outstanding real estate development financing was estimated by regional banking analysts at over $230 billion at the end of 2023. Figures at that scale require sustained growth to remain manageable. Some analysts argue that systems dependent on continuous expansion face long-term sustainability challenges, particularly when that expansion is taking place on soil that requires more time to stabilize than the financial calendar allows. The Burj Khalifa is not going to collapse. That is not the point of this analysis. The point is what that building represents within a larger pattern. It is the most visible symbol of a development model that has consistently prioritized the pace of expansion over the pace of stabilization. And what the available data is slowly and quietly beginning to show, millimeter by millimeter, is that the gap between the story being told about a city and the physical reality underneath it is a gap that eventually has to be accounted for, one way or another. The ground does not respond to press releases. It does not hold still because a financing agreement requires it to. And the question that matters for Dubai and for any city operating on a similar logic of rapid expansion in a challenging environment is this. At what point does the distance between what is claimed and what the substrate actually shows become wide enough that it cannot simply be reframed away? That gap is already being measured in millimeters by instruments orbiting the Earth. The more interesting question is what happens when enough people start paying attention to what those instruments are finding. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, share this video with one person who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me which city you think is running a similar playbook. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Strategic Dynamics Edge is built for viewers who stay until the end. You just proved you are one of them.